In the autumn of 2023, a retired anthracite miner named Robert Kovalenko was reinforcing the eastern foundation of his 1920s-era barn in the Hazleton district of Luzerne County, Pennsylvania, when his sledgehammer broke through a section of mortared stone that should not have existed. Behind that wall lay the entrance to a tunnel, deliberately sealed with brick and lime plaster, and the structural evidence suggested the sealing had occurred roughly a century ago. What Robert had disturbed was not merely a forgotten passage, but the entrance to a clandestine mine shaft, and the material traces preserved within would force a re-examination of one of the region's most contested industrial disasters. Robert had inherited the property from his grandfather in 2019. The barn itself was a modest structure, approximately 60 feet long and 35 feet wide, constructed in the typical fieldstone vernacular of early 20th century rural Pennsylvania. Its eastern wall faced what had once been open coal field, now largely reclaimed scrub forest. The wall itself bore the characteristic patina of a century: lichen blooms in pale green, patches of exposed mortar where stones had settled, and the faint oxidation marks where iron fasteners had corroded and wept rust stains down the masonry. The foundation, sunk into the red clay subsoil, had begun to shift and separate from the superstructure, a common failure pattern in agricultural buildings of that age. The contractor Robert hired, a structural engineer named Dr. Marcus Webb, arrived in late September to assess the damage and recommend repairs. Webb was a meticulous professional of the sort who had spent 34 years documenting structural failures across the Rust Belt: abandoned mills, collapsed railway trestles, condemned tenements. He worked methodically, using a handheld GPR scanner to map voids and stress fractures beneath the surface of the wall, taking soil samples, photographing every fissure with oblique lighting to capture shadow and dimension. It was during this routine documentation that Webb's small handheld radar detected an anomalous void behind the eastern face, precisely aligned with the masonry joint where Robert's sledgehammer had breached the brick. Webb made a careful incision in the mortar, enlarging the fracture methodically with a cold chisel and mallet, working in silence while dust accumulated on his safety glasses. The void behind the wall was not a natural cavity or a construction defect. The opening was geometric, deliberate, faced with dressed stones that bore the tool marks of handwork, pick and crowbar marks, not the weathered randomness of geological formation. When Webb aimed his flashlight through the breach, the beam caught what appeared to be the metal frame of a wooden doorway structure, corroded hinges still fixed to a timber, and beyond that, a passage descending into darkness with a slope angle of roughly 20 degrees. The air that emerged from the tunnel opening carried a particular character. It was cold, but not fresh. It was the cold of underground stillness, of a space that had not exchanged air with the surface world for decades. Within that cold air was the scent of mineral dust, faintly acidic, and beneath that, something else, a thin metallic note, as if copper or iron had been exposed to moisture for an extended period. Webb collected air samples using a portable multi-gas detector before proceeding further. The results showed elevated carbon dioxide levels, depleted oxygen, and trace sulfur compounds, consistent with coal oxidation in confined spaces. The air was not immediately toxic, but it was old in a way that suggested genuine temporal isolation. Webb contacted the Hazleton Historical Society, the Luzerne County Records Office, and the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. He also called Robert and advised him not to proceed without professional documentation. The initial archival search revealed what the historical record already contained: that the property had belonged to the Hazleton Colliery Company between 1898 and 1924, and that it had been used as a surface installation, storage for sorted coal, a bathhouse for miners, and a wooden structure for weighing and recording daily output. The company had ceased operations in the region in 1924, following a catastrophic mine collapse that killed 19 men in an adjacent shaft to the north. The official narrative, preserved in newspaper accounts and company documents, stated that the disaster was an unforeseeable geological event, a sudden subsidence of the coal seam itself. The mine was sealed, the surface operations were abandoned, and the company relocated its assets to anthracite fields farther north in Schuylkill County. But the tunnel behind Robert's barn suggested a different geography entirely. If it connected to the sealed mine, then the surface installation had not been merely adjacent to the disaster site, it had been directly above it, or connected to it by human construction. The tunnel's deliberate sealing, its careful brick and mortar work, suggested that someone had wanted to conceal not just the shaft itself, but also the surface passage that provided access to it. This was not the aftermath of abandonment. This was the trace of active concealment. Webb and a team of 3 specialists, a mine safety officer named Janet Krupnick, a structural archaeologist named Dr. David Chen, and a geotechnical engineer named Frank Dombrowski, assembled their equipment on the morning of October 3rd. They brought battery-powered lighting, air monitors, a handheld thermal imaging camera, and a small digital video camera capable of recording in low-light conditions. Before entering the tunnel, they tested the structure above. The barn's eastern wall, they confirmed, was not load-bearing. It was a perimeter wall, which meant the tunnel's existence would not compromise the building's integrity. The passage descended at a gentle slope, following the natural subsidence of the terrain, its walls reinforced with timber joists set into the native stone every 3 feet. The joists themselves were rough-hewn, split by hand, and their exposed wood bore the characteristic dark staining of coal dust ground into the grain over many decades. 30 feet into the tunnel, the passage opened into a chamber. The chamber was roughly circular, approximately 20 feet in diameter, and it contained the remains of what appeared to be a hauling system, a hemp rope, degraded but still intact, wrapped around a timber pulley that had been anchored to the ceiling. Coal dust lay on every surface in a fine uniform layer, like a forensic fingerprint left by the last day of operation. At the far end of the chamber, a shaft descended vertically into absolute darkness. Beside the shaft opening lay a leather-bound ledger, closed and desiccated, its cover split along the spine. When Webb carefully opened it, using archival handling procedures, the pages within bore handwritten entries in pencil, dated consecutively throughout the year 1924, with the final entry dated March 17, 1924, 3 days before the official disaster announcement. The discovery of that ledger would prove to be the threshold between historical assumption and historical truth. Dr. David Chen, who specialized in archival recovery and paleography, spent the first hour simply photographing the ledger in situ before removing it from the chamber. The leather cover was a deep cognac brown, cracked and fissured with age, bound with what appeared to be original twine wrapped around the spine in a figure-8 pattern. The paper within was brittle but not friable. It had maintained structural integrity due to the stable temperature and low humidity of the sealed environment. Chen wore cotton gloves and worked under magnification, carefully turning each page, allowing the camera to capture both the handwriting and any marginalia or notations. What emerged was not a mining safety log as one might have expected, but something far more incriminating, a production ledger for an illegal coal extraction operation. The entries began in January 1924, recorded in a precise, educated hand that suggested the author was a clerk or accountant rather than a laborer. The first page bore a header written in blue ink: Hazelton Private Extract Security Protocol SS 1924, unauthorized disclosure prohibited. Beneath this were columns denoting dates, tonnage, destination, and payment records. The ledger documented the extraction of anthracite coal from what the official company records claimed had been an exhausted seam, a zone that had been marked as depleted and closed to further extraction in 1922. Yet the ledger showed consistent weekly removal of coal, quantities ranging from 8 to 14 tons per week, transported via the underground passage to the surface barn, where it was presumably sorted, weighed, and moved to an undocumented destination. The handwriting, while consistent, carried the subtle pressure variations of someone writing in dim light, and several entries bore annotations in a second, hastier script, initials only, dates, and numbers that appeared to be payment amounts or verification marks. One entry, dated February 14, 1924, bore a note in the margin: seam integrity compromised, structural support failing, recommend immediate halt. This notation was followed by 3 more entries in the same rapid hand, all dated within the subsequent week, each stamped with what appeared to be a rubber initials mark, JHM, followed by a date and a single word: proceed. Frank Dombrowski, the geotechnical engineer, examined the physical environment of the chamber with particular attention to its structural integrity. He used a handheld ultrasonic thickness gauge to measure the remaining coal seam visible in the shaft walls, took core samples of the surrounding stone, and deployed a 4-channel seismic accelerometer to detect any ongoing subsidence or microfracturing in the overhead structure. What he documented was evidence of systematic compromise. The timber supports that had been installed to reinforce the chamber showed signs of progressive failure, vertical splitting along the grain, horizontal shearing at the joints, and discoloration patterns that indicated the wood had been subjected to increasing loads over time. The coal seam itself, where exposed at the chamber walls, showed the characteristic fracture pattern of over-extraction, irregular voids, stress-relieved tensile failures, and what Dombrowski identified as the beginning stages of subsidence propagation upward toward the surface. He consulted his calculations with Webb. The chamber's dimensions, combined with the tonnage documented in the ledger, suggested that approximately 250 tons of coal had been removed from this section of the seam over an 11-week period, a rate of extraction that would have been economically marginal under normal circumstances, but potentially catastrophic from a structural perspective. A healthy seam requires adequate pillar support. Extraction at this volume compressed into this time frame, in a seam that had already been compromised by prior legitimate mining operations, would create a geometric stress concentration. The pillars would thin, the void fraction would increase, and eventually, at a point determined by material fatigue, groundwater pressure, and seasonal thermal cycling, the system would fail. The failure would not be catastrophic immediately. It would manifest as differential settlement, progressive ground subsidence, and increasing loads on whatever infrastructure existed above the compromised zone. Janet Krupnik, the mine safety officer, examined the tunnels themselves for evidence of atmospheric conditions at the time of sealing. She collected dust samples from the ledger's pages and from the wooden pulley system, analyzing their composition using a portable X-ray fluorescence device. The dust was indeed coal, but mixed with particulates from explosives, specifically ammonium nitrate and nitroglycerin compounds consistent with blasting powder used in coal mines during the 1920s. The concentration suggested multiple blast events in the chamber. The irregular pattern of residue on the pulley system indicated that the pulley had been in active use during the final period of extraction. Most significantly, Krupnik discovered that the timber joists supporting the tunnel walls bore burn marks, not extensive, but deliberate scorch patterns located at their midspans and junction points. These were not accidental. They appeared to have been created by controlled application of flame or hot implement, possibly in preparation for structural weakening or deliberate demolition. The accumulation of these findings converged toward an inescapable reinterpretation. The mine collapse of March 20th, 1924, which had killed 19 men working in the adjacent shaft and had been officially attributed to unexpected geological subsidence, had in fact been precipitated by systematic, clandestine illegal extraction conducted directly beneath the active mining operation. The ledger documented not only the theft of coal belonging to the Hazelton Colliery Company's stockholders, but also the deliberate circumvention of safety protocols, the suppression of structural warning signs, and the continuation of extraction operations in a seam that bore the signature of imminent failure. The initial notations suggested human decision-making. Specific individuals had evaluated the risk and elected to proceed. The barn's eastern wall, sealed with brick and lime, represented not an ordinary abandonment, but an active concealment operation. The obliteration of evidence, the entombment of documentation, and the deliberate denial of the clandestine infrastructure's existence. When Webb emerged from the tunnel on the afternoon of October 3rd, his expression bore the weight of someone who had confirmed not a technical anomaly, but a historical crime. He stood in the barn's failing light, dust particles suspended in the slanting beam from the western window, and he turned to Robert Kovalenko and spoke with deliberate simplicity. The disaster that had defined the region's memory, that had orphaned children and widowed women, had not been an act of nature. It had been the result of calculated human decisions, made in a sealed tunnel, recorded in a leather ledger, and subsequently erased from official history. The question that remained was not whether the catastrophe had occurred, but why the truth had been sealed away for 100 years, and who had possessed the authority to make such a sealing permanent. The ledger was transferred to climate-controlled archival storage at the Hazelton Historical Society on October 5, 2023, where it was catalogued and subjected to further analysis. Dr. Chen coordinated with a paleographer at the University of Pennsylvania to authenticate the handwriting and date the ink through spectrographic analysis. Meanwhile, Webb and Krupnik began cross-referencing the ledger's documented extraction dates against the historical record maintained in the Luzerne County Records Office and the archives of the Anthracite Heritage Museum in Scranton. What emerged was a pattern of deliberate institutional erasure so systematic that it suggested not mere negligence or bureaucratic oversight, but active suppression. The Hazleton Colliery Company had maintained 3 sets of books. The first, held in the public archives, contained the official production records filed with the state and distributed to stockholders. These records showed declining output from the contentious seam beginning in 1921, with complete cessation of extraction by January 1922, attributed to geological exhaustion. The second set of records, discovered in the basement of the company's former administrative building in Hazleton, revealed a different narrative. These ledgers documented ongoing extraction from the same seam throughout 1922 and into early 1924, but they employed a coded notation system. The seam was referred to by a numeric designation rather than its official name. The tonnage figures were prefixed with a symbol that appeared to indicate private account, and the destination entries were blank, replaced with a simple dash. Cross-referencing the dates and numeric values suggested these records corresponded to the clandestine extraction documented in the tunnel ledger, but they bore the authorization stamps of 3 individuals: James Hastings Mercer, General Manager of Hazleton Operations, Thomas Reginald Lockhart, Chief Engineer, and Albert Cornelius Webb, Comptroller and Finance Director. The third set of records, however, proved most revealing. In the personal papers of Mercer himself, which had been preserved by his daughter and donated to the Historical Society in 1987, Webb discovered a sequence of memoranda addressed to the company's board of directors, located in Philadelphia. These memos, dated between November 1923 and February 1924, revealed the operational logic behind the clandestine extraction. The anthracite market had collapsed in the early 1920s. Demand had fallen sharply as petroleum replaced coal as the dominant industrial fuel. The Hazleton Colliery Company, like many regional operators, faced bankruptcy. The publicly documented seam had been legitimately exhausted, but geological surveys indicated that a secondary coal body, smaller but commercially viable, remained accessible beneath the primary extraction zone. Mercer proposed a plan to extract this secondary seam covertly, avoiding the costs and regulatory scrutiny that would accompany official operations, and selling the coal through informal channels to regional industrial customers. The profit would recapitalize the company and maintain investor confidence while the market recovered. Each memo bore responses in the margins, written in a precise hand identified as belonging to Mercer's superior, Director William Ashford Clark, who oversaw all anthracite operations for the company's parent holding corporation, based in New York. Clark's marginal notes tracked the evolution from cautious inquiry to explicit authorization. In November, he had written, "Geologically feasible." By December, he had annotated, "Proceed with engineering assessment." In January 1924, his note read simply, "Approved. Minimal documentation protocol." Alongside this approval, Clark had initialed a separate document, a directive to the company's legal department instructing them to ensure that the private extraction ledger be segregated from official records and maintained under executive access protocol only. Krupnick obtained the engineering reports that Lockhart had submitted to Mercer throughout the operation. These were the most damning documents. Lockhart, who was a trained mining engineer, had conducted structural surveys of the secondary seam before extraction began. His initial report, dated October 1923, was unambiguous. The seam's geometrical relationship to the primary extraction zone was problematic. The pillar support system left after the legitimate mining had depleted the primary seam was inadequate to sustain additional extraction from the secondary zone without substantial additional support. Lockhart recommended that any clandestine extraction be accompanied by proactive reinforcement of the pillar structure and careful monitoring of subsidence. His estimated cost for proper engineering controls was approximately $4,700, a substantial sum in 1924, roughly 15% of the anticipated profit. 3 weeks after submitting this report, Lockhart sent a second memorandum to Mercer. The tone was defensive, the language carefully qualified. He noted that while his initial assessment had identified certain structural risks, these risks were manageable, provided extraction rates remained within specified parameters, and monitoring protocols were rigorously applied. He did not withdraw his recommendation for structural reinforcement, but he did provide alternative scenarios in which extraction could proceed with acceptable risk levels if the operation remained brief, the tonnage remained moderate, and no catastrophic geological events occurred. This second report bore Mercer's annotation, Approved, Standard Monitoring, JHM. The implication was clear. Lockhart had initially provided professional counsel recommending proper engineering safeguards. Mercer had deemed those safeguards too expensive. Lockhart, faced with pressure from his superior, had produced a second opinion that technically did not contradict his first assessment, but which removed the explicit recommendation for reinforcement and substituted probabilistic language about acceptable risk. This rhetorical maneuver allowed Mercer to proceed with the extraction while avoiding the direct contradiction of engineering advice. The actual extraction operation, according to the coordinated records and the ledger itself, had proceeded for 11 weeks at rates that exceeded what Lockhart's second report had identified as necessary for structural safety. The monitoring protocols that were ostensibly rigorously applied appeared to have been minimal. The only structural assessment documented was a single visual inspection conducted by Lockhart on February 20th, which produced a report now filed in the company archives. Lockhart's notation on that report was terse. Subsidence indicators present. Recommend immediate halt. This notation bore Mercer's response written directly beneath it, dated 3 days later. Proceed. Market conditions require full extraction completion. JHM. On March 17, 1924, the ledger's final entry recorded a coal removal of 12 tons. 4 days later, at 2:47 in the afternoon, the seam that had been systematically undermined failed catastrophically. The subsidence propagated upward through the overlying strata, rupturing the active mining shaft where 19 men were working. They died in the collapse, their bodies recovered days later from the debris. Webb compiled this archival evidence into a comprehensive chronology, which he presented to the Luzerne County District Attorney's Office in October 2023. The question that remained was not whether negligence and deliberate decision-making had caused the disaster, but whether anyone could be held accountable for actions taken 100 years prior. The answer, it turned out, lay in understanding what had motivated the systematic concealment. The deeper chambers of the tunnel system, which Webb's team accessed through progressive excavation over the subsequent weeks, yielded physical evidence that transformed the archival narrative into something irreducible and human. Approximately 70 feet beyond the main chamber, the passage terminated in what appeared to be a wall of collapsed debris, timber fragments, stone fragments, and a layer of compressed coal dust several feet thick. When this debris was carefully removed under archaeological protocol, it revealed not an obstruction but an entombment. Behind the collapse lay the entrance to a second shaft, one that connected directly to the mining level where the 19 men had been working on March 21st. The connection was structural and undeniable. The clandestine tunnel did not merely exist adjacent to the legitimate operation, it existed as a direct structural dependency. The failure of the secondary seam had indeed propagated upward and inward, destabilizing the pillar system that supported both the clandestine tunnel and the active mining shaft simultaneously. Within the debris of the collapse, Krupnik discovered fragmentary human remains, specifically bones consistent with a human hand, calcified and darkened by coal dust and mineral percolation, bearing the traces of being trapped and crushed under load-bearing stone. The skeletal elements were recovered with forensic precision and transferred to the Luzerne County Coroner's Office for analysis. Subsequent examination confirmed that the remains belonged to an individual male, aged between 40 and 60 years, who had been positioned in the collapsed debris in a way consistent with having attempted to escape through the breach between the two shafts at the moment of subsidence. Dental analysis and comparison against missing persons reports from the 1924 disaster indicated that this was the remains of Heinrich Kessler, a German immigrant miner who had been officially recorded as one of the 19 victims, though his body had never been recovered. He had been in the secondary shaft passage at the moment of collapse, not in the legitimate mining operation, but in the clandestine one, and he had been abandoned there, his body entombed in the sealed tunnel, his death documented as having occurred in the legitimate operation, his true location and circumstances erased from the official narrative. The presence of Kessler's remains in the clandestine tunnel changed the legal and moral calculus substantially. Kessler had either been working in the illegal operation directly, or he had been sent into the tunnel on some task related to the extraction process. Either interpretation suggested that at least one of the 19 recorded victims had actually been engaged in the clandestine operation at the moment of the collapse. This raised the probability that others of the 19 might also have been working in or near the sealed tunnel, and that their presence and participation in the illegal extraction had been deliberately obscured in the aftermath. The district attorney's investigation, which proceeded concurrently with Webb's structural documentation, pursued the question of post-disaster cover-up with particular rigor. Interviews with descendants of the original disaster victims, cross-referenced against company payroll records and accident reports, revealed discrepancies that had been overlooked for a century. 3 of the 19 recorded victims bore notations in Mercer's personal papers, identifying them as secondary seam personnel. They had been assigned to work in the clandestine extraction, not in the legitimate mining operation. Yet the official disaster report, filed by the company and accepted by state regulators, had listed them without differentiation, treating them as workers in the regular shaft who had been killed by unexpected subsidence. No investigation had been conducted into why men had been working in a shaft that was officially supposed to be closed. No questions had been asked about the presence of an underground passage connecting the two operations. No technical inspection had been mandated to examine whether the disaster had resulted from the structural compromise created by the clandestine extraction. The suppression had been systematic and immediate. Within 72 hours of the collapse, Mercer had instructed company counsel to prepare a statement for the press, emphasizing that the disaster had occurred in a legitimately operated shaft, and that all victims had been properly certified miners engaged in authorized work. He had ordered the destruction of the second set of books, the coded ledgers, and he had personally sealed the tunnel passage behind the barn by directing workers to brick up the entrance with no documentation of the work. He had then visited the state mining inspector, Reginald Hastings, and provided him with the official company narrative, along with what internal memos later revealed to be substantial financial consideration, ostensibly for consulting services, but understood by all parties as compensation for the inspector's acceptance of the company's account without independent investigation. Mercer lived until 1961, retired and respected. His role in the clandestine operation never revealed during his lifetime. Lockhart died in 1954 after a stroke, having never publicly acknowledged his initial warnings or his subsequent qualified approval of the dangerous extraction. Clark, the director based in New York, transferred to another company in 1926 and maintained a successful career in anthracite management until his retirement in 1951. None of them had ever been charged, questioned, or held accountable. The disaster had simply been absorbed into the historical record as one more tragedy of the industrial age. Unfortunate, inevitable, the cost of progress. The reparation that finally occurred in 2024 was modest but meaningful. The remains of Heinrich Kessler were transferred to the care of the Kessler family descendants, who arranged a proper burial and memorial service at St. John the Baptist Polish Catholic Church in Hazleton, where Kessler's name had been inscribed on the disaster memorial for 100 years. The ceremony included attendance by representatives of the Historical Society, the district attorney, and Webb himself, who spoke briefly about the importance of structural truth and the imperative to re-examine catastrophes when new evidence emerged. The tunnel passage was properly sealed by professional engineers, not concealed, but sealed with a commemorative plaque that documented the discovery and acknowledged the 19 victims by name, with an additional notation indicating that at least 3 had been working in the clandestine operation at the moment of disaster. A memorial marker was installed at the site of the barn in October 2024, bearing text composed by Dr. Chen. In this place for 100 years, the truth was sealed beneath brick and time. In 1924, economic pressure and human choice created conditions that killed 19 men. Their names and the full circumstances of their deaths are recorded here, so that memory itself becomes honest. The ledger was donated to the Anthracite Heritage Museum, where it remains on display, its pages protected behind glass, its handwriting visible, its implications irreducible. On the final afternoon of November, Webb stood alone at the edge of the reclaimed coalfield, looking back toward the barn and the sealed tunnel beneath it. The landscape had returned to scrub forest and weathered stone, the industrial apparatus of the 19th century distributed as fragments across the terrain. He thought about the men who had died, about the decision-makers who had chosen profit over safety, about the institutions that had colluded in erasure. The tunnel behind the barn had held its silence for 100 years, waiting for someone to listen. In the end, the past does not remain buried. It surfaces, slow and patient, until the weight of truth becomes too great for any wall to contain.